Good afternoon. My name is Sue Perdue, and I am Director of Grants and Fellowships at Virginia Humanities. Welcome to our first virtual workshop for grantees and other interested folks. We have more than 150 of you registered for today's event, which will be recorded and made available afterward on our YouTube channel. We plan to offer a series of online workshops in the months to come and are very interested in knowing what your needs are. We will follow up today with a short survey for everybody who is registered to attend to ask you about today's workshop and to let us know what your other topics of interest might be. Is it grant writing, using social media, evaluating impact of your programs? These are just a few of the topics that we might address. Because we have so many folks lined up today, we will only have video on for the presenters. So we ask you to put your questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation in the order they were submitted. Today, we are very pleased to introduce our presenters, Rich Borenstein and Sherry Staples, principals of Cinnabar Productions based in Newport News. Their presentation is called Saving Stories, a webinar on oral history best practices and realistic applications. Rich and Sherry have been principals of Cinnabar for several decades and have extensive experience working with many nonprofits in Virginia, museums, and other organizations to do video production and oral history, which is our topic today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Rich and Sherry.
Here we are. So I guess we're on.
We're on. Good afternoon. I'm Sherry Staples, and that's Rich Borenstein.
And we are going to be talking about oral histories. And for those of you who are fond of PowerPoints, I hate to disappoint you, but you have us for about the next hour as we talk about this. There is an outline that's available that hopefully you'll have the opportunity to download and follow along with us. But first off, I wanted to start off with what is an oral history. An oral history is a systematic collection of living people's testimony about their own experience. Oral history is not folklore, it's not gossip, hearsay, or rumor. It's people's stories. And it's a way that history has been passed for generations and it's still valid today. There's a difference between doing an oral history and doing an interview.
So an oral history is more of a free flow where you ask questions and is basically about that person's life story. An interview is usually for something being a part of a bigger or larger program. So it could be experts in their field. It could be, participants or victims of some sort of tragedy or some sort of historic moment, but you're doing the interviews to get specific information so that you have a plan for a bigger project, and that fits into that plan. So it's it's usually shorter, and it's usually much more pointed questions, and to get the answers that that person can provide. So we did a piece, on 1619, and we chose all kinds of things from our state senator to historical professors and people about segregation, and also about the African-American experience of arriving. So they all were examples of their studies, whereas an oral history is a person's life.
The main context of that is that you learn about the person, where they were born, where they grew up. And in most cases, oral histories deal with more senior people, only because they have more history to tell, but that isn't always the case. Oral histories of significant events can involve anybody that was a participant in that event. But again, you're looking for first-person accounts of stories. Now, before you begin an oral history, there are several steps that you have to take in terms of planning and preparation. Normally, you would have an oral history based around a certain topic. And what I mean by that is you would do an oral history of maybe a family or a town or an industry, or in some cases, an art form, a particular tribe. I mean, there are several different topics that you would concentrate as opposed to just getting oral histories about anything and everybody. Just so you have some way of determining what kind of questions you're going to ask and who you're going to ask them of. So these research that you do beforehand allows you to define more closely how you're going to approach all these different individuals and how you're going to get the information from them that you want. Now, there are different ways of doing oral histories. You can do them either using audio or you can use video.
Not because it's just my profession, because I did start out as a videographer, but quite frankly, I prefer oral histories that are both video and audio recordings. You can do the audio recordings alone, but my problem with that is you can't see the faces. You can't put a face to a name or to a voice. And most importantly, when you're doing oral histories, the person's face can tell you a million things. It can tell emotion. We have had World War II vets who have almost flashback moments, and you can see their in their face. We've had people who become emotional about what they're talking about. And it's really, to me, so much better to see someone and listen to them and watch their reactions and watch their gestures. And so I know who they are and what they look like. And so I would always recommend that. The subject matter may make a big difference too. I mean, you want to have them maybe, to talk about what they're doing, what they did. And it's just, I just think it's kind of awkward to talk to somebody and not see them. It's also very awkward, to also not look at them and hear this story, not be able to, identify the person.
We did an oral history of Ivor Noel Hume, who some of you might recognize was considered the father of historical archaeology. And one of the things we were able to do by doing it on camera is he was able to show us some of his collection and talk about individual objects and things, which obviously would not be possible if it was an audio only. One of the big considerations, which we'll get into a little bit later, is just the ease of doing one versus the other. Video recording is a little more involved than just an audio recording, but the benefits, we believe, outweigh the difficulties. So one of the other considerations you have when you start a project is, are you going to be able to do this all in-house, or are you going to contract out part of it? We obviously enjoy being contracted out to do it, but there are considerations, obviously financially, as to whether or not it's feasible to hire somebody to do it. You also have to look for somebody who knows how to do it. Having video camera or equipment does not necessarily make you an oral historian and suitable to do the work. And sometimes people who are in an organization who think it's a great idea to do it don't have the expertise, or at least the experience, to be able to conduct the interviews. So those are all part of the planning steps, as taking a look at how much in terms of resources do you have to dedicate to the project, and then using them appropriately. So one of the things that also come up in our work particularly is scheduling. And doing an oral history, when they talk about best practices, what they normally say is 2 hours dedicated to an oral history. We found that most of them usually last about an hour or so, but you really need the time to establish a little rapport with the individual. You might have some technical issues you have to work out. So scheduling more than 4 in a day is problematic at times. Now, some situations come up where you have to do more than that just because of the availability of people. A long time ago, we did interviews with the first graduating class of Tuskegee, the Tuskegee Airmen at the Virginia Air and Space Center in Hampton. And they were having a reunion, and they asked us to come and do oral histories, but they were basically grabbing them out of the reunion and dragging them into a room and sitting them down saying, go ahead and do it. They've agreed. And so they were just shoveling them in. We ended up doing about 9 in the course of the day, which is a lot. It's a lot because the person doing the interviews forgets who they're talking to after a time. And you need some time to process what it is that's being said. So the 4 to 5 maximum is probably a good basis.
Yeah, and then you also have to, standing behind a camera for 8 hours is a long time too. But you do what you have to do. And in that case, they were only there for the weekend. And so we only had a Friday night and Saturday. And I think we went into Saturday night because the next day they'd be leaving. So it was very important to us to make sure we got as many as possible. The best news about that one was the oral histories, which was what they were intended to be, turned to be so amazing that it became a 60-minute documentary that eventually went national. So it was just one of those things where the story had to be told. I mean, they were leaping out of the tape and talking to us. So that was an amazing project. So that's another thing you run into sometimes.
Also with scheduling, you have the issue as to whether or not you can gather people on spot to do the histories, or if you're going to have to travel to their locations. Again, that goes back to factoring in who's going to do it, how much equipment are you going to be taking. So their travel time sometimes enters into that too, where you say, well, we're going to do 4 today, but you find out that it takes you 45 minutes. Or if you're in Hampton Roads, it takes you an extra hour to get through the tunnels to actually get to the individual to do that. So scheduling is a very important aspect of it. Then we get into the issues of actually doing the histories themselves. So first off is audio and microphones.
Without a lot of people use a camera microphone, and that is what is usually omnidirectional, so it's picking up everybody. So you're getting narrator, you're getting the person that's being interviewed, you get the train going outside, you get anything and everything that's audible in that room. But what you really want is to have at least one. You really need the interviewer being their questions being recorded, but if you want to know what they asked, you want to make sure that that's on the tape and you can understand why the person's responding that way. But you absolutely need a clear, pristine signal audio for your interviewee. And that usually is a lavalier mic. Sometimes you can do a boom mic. I don't know that many people are going to invest in a boom mic because that's pretty much for professional houses. But if you're going to do it in-house, lavalier mics are not very expensive at all. So, but you want the best audio you can get, obviously, because they're telling the stories. So if you snap, crackle, pop, or you have a lot of distraction in the background, then you've got, and that is not something that is easily removed. Can be, but it's going to cost you more money than it would be to just start all over again. So audio is the most important because, of course, it's again what you're recording in the histories on their minds and their mouths. So,
if you're going into video, one of the biggest problems that people encounter is poor lighting. We did a project for a historical society that did their own oral histories, and the audio was fine, but they did them as videos, and they didn't pay attention to the lighting at all. This particular organization was primarily African American, So we have a lot of very dark-skinned individuals who they put up against the window, so the light was coming from behind them, and you actually couldn't see the faces of the people that were talking, which kind of defeated the whole purpose of having a video in the first place. So lighting is essential if you're going to shoot a video, whether it be with a video camera, on a cell phone, whatever it is, you still need to be able to see the individual clearly. And nowadays, lighting is very inexpensive. You can buy LED lights that are battery powered that are $50, $60 that will do a professional looking job. So it's no longer a major expense to have really nice lighting for the individual. And in terms of lighting also, you need to have a nice background for them. A neutral background is always ideal, or a background that somehow associates with what the person is talking about or where they're at. Try to avoid things growing out of the back of their head, objects in the foreground that are distracting, doing advertisements for Coca-Cola or Pepsi by having cans in the front. So just paying attention to the environment that you're into is also important.
One more thing about lighting. I mean, it used to be when I started back in 1982, lighting was hard. It's very hard. And, you know, if you want a drama look, I mean, there's certain techniques to give you a certain ambiance with the person or the thing you're shooting. But in an oral history, I don't know if that's that necessary. But with again, these LED lights are fabulous. They'll give you a nice light, nice warm light, and you don't have to fiddle faddle with them a whole lot. But yeah, sometimes you go back after you've taped someone or recorded someone, and literally they have a plant right out of their head, or some stuff behind them in the background that's distracting. And the other thing he mentioned about having a backdrop that's nice is that every time you change the background, you have to change the light, the location, the camera. So say you're doing a whole series of oral histories on migrant farm workers. I don't know why that came to my mind, but it did. And so if you could just get the nice background, like a light black with some lighting on the back of it, or a blue, they're really nice colors, not too stark so the camera loses it, so people look good in front of it. So that's why I said black or blue. But make sure that they're well lit. And like I said, check every corner of your viewfinder, because something will inevitably pop up, and you really have to make sure it's not there or you don't accidentally get it. So
one of the things that have come up recently is doing remote recording, and now in the post-pandemic era, a lot of people are now doing Zoom meetings. It's possible to do an oral history, do a video oral history, and do it remotely. It's a little more fraught with problems. Technically, it can be done, but having a person, particularly someone who's a little bit older, talking to a computer sometimes can be a little unnerving, or they'll have problems technically setting it up. There are services where you actually record the interview in your computer and it's saved at a third location, so it's not subject to the internet, and then you can download what's been recorded, and it's at the same quality of whatever the camera is on the computer, so you can do high definition. Which gets us back to a whole other issue when we're talking about recording equipment, and that is storage. We talked about tapes, we talked about film, and now we use chips on all of our recording equipment. None of this stuff is archival. The last archival medium that they really came up with was black and white film. So all these things that have two issues associated with them. One is that it's not particularly archival. Even if you do it to a DVD or a CD, it does not have the shelf life that, of forever. And the other is how much storage space it takes up. We are working a current project of a number of oral histories that were done in standard definition video. The video itself is about 250 megabytes for an hour. We've done MP3s of the interviews, which are only about 15 or 20 megabytes. If you do the same thing in high definition, you're talking about a gigabyte per hour. That means it all has to be stored somewhere, flash drives, external drives, but you have to be cognizant of how much space it's taking. And if you're using a cell phone, which is now almost a standard for a lot of people because the cameras are so good and you can do the digital audio recording with them as well, you still have to be aware of how much space you have and have a good way of getting it off your phone and saving it somewhere else. If you are shooting video, the other important thing is to use a tripod or some device to lock the camera down so it's not shaking, because there's nothing worse than someone vibrating through a whole interview. And there are simple and inexpensive mounts for cell phones as well. And if you are going to use a cell phone, please record using it horizontally, not vertically, just because of later applications. As you know, your eyesight is based on seeing things horizontally. That's why TV screens are horizontal and movie screens are horizontal. People just shoot vertically because that's the way they're used to holding their phone, but it has a lot less use later on. It's harder to view later on.
Two things I wanted to touch on, elaborate a little bit regarding things that Richard talked about. When he talked about using your camera, one of the things I find a drawback to, and that's because I'm a professional, so I'm a fuss budget, but you don't have as much adaptability with your cell phone unless you buy the best cell phone you've ever had. And that's all you use it for is for pictures and shooting, shooting media. Because I don't even know, it's not even video anymore. It's really just media of some sort. It depends on what your base is. But anyhow, I'm just not a big fan of it. It's also harder to keep because of the megabytes and because of the little SIM cards. And also, then you have to transfer it all over somewhere, and because you can't leave it on your little SIM card. So that's a little bit of an issue. And the reason I would recommend video cameras now is the first video camera I operated was $37,000 with a $7,000 lens. I did not own the company at that time. Now you can get a really great, absolutely 4K video camera for about $1,500. Maybe, you can even maybe find a little less if you find a refurb or something like that. They're not that expensive. They really aren't. And they give you a whole lot more option, and they're not very hard to operate either. So, I mean, it's always well to have something like that because it's a real investment that once you have one, you'll find a lot of ways to use it. So that's one of my other things. What I wanted to say about Zoom, we were talking about interviewing an elderly person over Zoom, and that's fine. However, there is something, I'm a big people person, and there's something lost both to the interviewer and the person being interviewed when you don't have a person there. You're talking to, like right now, I'm talking to a black screen, which is a little disconcerting. But when you're asking someone who's not used to technology quite as much as we are, heck, I'm so far behind, I'm always trying to catch up. It's really nice to have a person to talk to, a person to see, and that you can see the person. It's much more intimate to have a regular interview / conversation one-on-one, as opposed to, you may have to. I mean, you may not have a choice, but we've traveled to do a number of things because that person was out of state, and we needed. And what happened was when we did the Tuskegee Airmen, we went and interviewed Chief Anderson, and he was the civilian pilot instructor of the Tuskegee Airmen. And we were telling him, how much so sad that he was gone and we wouldn't be able to interview him. And they proceeded to tell us he was very much alive. He was the man who flew Eleanor Roosevelt, and she went back to Franklin and said yes. But we went down to his home in Tuskegee, And Rich actually got to fly with him. I got to fly the chase plane, in the chase plane, but we got to see the airfield. He could talk about it. We got to see him in a plane flying. It was just, it was an experience. And he probably would just as good if he had been at a museum, like at the Air and Space Museum, and we'd interview him there. But I just don't see Chief Anderson having done a Zoom. It's just very impersonal. So
We did a recent piece for the Army Transportation Museum, and they wanted to do an individual who was only available for a limited time, and he was in Wisconsin. And so we did set up a remote interview with him. And technically it was fine, but it was just a little jarring because everybody else had been at the museum and had the backdrop of the museum, and he was in his home. And one of the things, just from a aesthetic standpoint, and even now, like I have problems staring at the black screen too, is when you're doing an interview, if you do an interview on video, you don't want to have the person looking directly at the camera. That kind of makes it look more like an interrogation as well. You try to get them to look slightly off camera, either left or right. And that was really interesting to do it in a remote Zoom-like setting where we had the individual. We should just find some place on the wall to look at and talk to that rather than to the camera. And it worked out fine, but you could tell that the person doing it was felt a little strange talking to a candle off on the wall. So, like I said, there are ways of doing it. It just takes a little more planning and effort to do it that way.
usually the person being interviewed is looking at the person doing the interview. So, they always sit a little diagonally because if somebody's talking to you direct onto the camera, it looks like they're selling you a used car. So it's very jarring. So otherwise they get more relaxed to talk to a human being. So that's my spiel about that. Just the good part.
Okay.
Here comes the fun part.
Okay, so we finally got to the part where we can actually conduct the interview. Now, conducting the interview means actually having somebody sitting across from you that you're talking to and how you're going to talk to them. One of the things that we found is that you can only do one interview at a time. You can't have multiple people do it because they'll talk over each other, will not get a complete story. It becomes very difficult to work with later to figure out how you're going to use it. So remember, it's one at a time. Yes, I'll get to that.
You're gonna get to that next? Okay.
I'll get to that.
All right. You have to excuse us. This is our first webinar. We're doing the best we can. So one of the number one things is when you are the interviewer, you are there to ask questions. You're not there to agree or disagree with somebody. You're not there to contradict something said. If you're interviewing an elderly person and they make a mistake and maybe they're a little ahead of themselves time-wise, just let it go. Because the minute you start correcting them, that's going to put them off, and it's also going to make them feel less than. But also that it's a conversation, an interaction between two people, whether it's by Zoom or whether it's face to face. It's between two people, and it is not for the benefit of the interviewer, even though he may think he knows everything about the Spanish-American War, and the guy mistakes it for something else. That's not your place to stop something. You're doing something, although I don't know who you'd find from the Spanish-American War be alive now, but anyway, so yeah, it's not your job. It's yours to ask questions and encourage that speaker.
So the questions you need to ask are the basic ones that they teach in journalism, which are the 5 W's and an H, if you're familiar with those, which are the who, what, why, when, and where, and how. Oral histories can be very tedious if all you're getting are yes and no's where you have all the information and they're just either acknowledging that it happened or didn't happen. You want to find out, why did it happen? How are they involved? What was their feelings about it? Who else was around? Those are the key questions that need to be answered. So you want to try to avoid yes and no questions the best you can, and only use those to lead you into questions that you can elaborate on. And the other thing is, which is probably most important, is you got to listen to the answers.
Listening to the answers is essential because we have a situation. I'm not going to name names, but we have a situation where we're doing a lot of interviews right now, not doing the interviews, but editing them, formatting them, getting them ready to go to the Library of Congress and to the
National Archives.
National Archives. So the gentleman there that is the narrator has a bad tendency to not listen to what they're saying. He's got a set of questions. So you come in with a set of questions, and he's going to follow that set of questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if the person answers the question and then takes a turn, then you follow where they're going and listen to what they say. So this gentleman says that he went to see the Yorktown, the carrier down in Charleston, and he couldn't get down below where he wanted to go. He was a World War II vet. And a couple minutes later, this person says, "So have you been to Charleston?" Not good. I'll say something else. This is not exactly the structures we thought, but as it brings up another topic, and that is that if someone changes something in their direction, the person being interviewed, go with it. Perfect example. I have a gentleman who was a Korean War vet. He was infantry on the front line for the better part of the year, but the second year he was in Korea, he became a cook and went all the way up to mess cook, who's in charge of the mess. At no time did the interviewer pick up that piece of information. He let him talk all about it, but at no time did he say, "Well, how did that happen? How did you go from being in the infantry to being to being now the mess sergeant?" Very different. So something happened, but he let the guy tell the story, but then boom, we're back right on schedule with whatever it was.
Well, unfortunately, this particular project has about 1,000 examples of how not to do it. We'll spare you most of those. One of the other things, though, that when you're asking questions, ask one question at a time. This particular individual that we're referring to will start off his interviews by saying, "Tell me what was going on with your life? When you decided you were going to go into the Army? How did your parents feel about it? What did your girlfriend think about it? Tell me about all that stuff." And usually the person being interviewed will stare for a second, trying to figure out how to answer. So one question at a time, and then deal with that. Remember, as Sherry had pointed out, that we like to say it's more of a conversation than a deposition. We're not interrogating, the person is giving their history. So they're always going to tell their story. And so whatever they say, and we often start off our conversations with them by saying, "You can't tell us anything that's wrong because it's your story." And that's the way you have to let it go. Another important aspect of conducting the interview is you don't step on the answer. And what we mean by that is if someone's talking, don't interrupt them. Let them finish their thought. The gentleman that we're referring to, now, of course, these interviews were done 20 years ago, so we're be very righteous 20 years later about how things were done. But anyway, he has a tendency of talking over when the person's about to answer or answering, to put his 2 cents in, or not even 2 cents worth, and interrupting the flow. So sometimes the answer becomes unintelligible, which is not very helpful either.
Because they got two voices on top of each other. So even though you can hear him on a camera mic, he's still interfering with the actual audio. And he has a tendency to go, "Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I know that must have been great." And just, it's really hard to sit there and be quiet and just let these people continue to talk, even if you have something you might have in common or you're interested in what they're saying and you express enthusiasm. Minimum amount of talk, and now we have jet fighters overhead. So, but yeah, it's very important. You're not the star. Your opinion does not matter. Your thoughts on the matter don't matter. It's not about you. You're there to serve and bring out that person. One other thing about getting off topic, I had a gentleman who was in the Battle of the Bulge and also ended up went to Korea later on. He's in the Battle of the Bulge and they're surrounded by Germans. And at one point they knew that where they were in that vicinity, they were going to be captured, was inevitable. And they have 88, bullets going past and all of this. And so the gentleman's talking about, when it becomes inevitable, they're going to have to surrender. And he says what he did to surrender. And then he says, and his face changes and he says, and that's when I became a prisoner of war of the Germans. And the response back was, well, how did those 88 sound when they're whizzing by your ears? Because that interested the the interviewer more than, and there was no explanation of what happened to him. It just kind of jumped around a little bit. But when somebody lays and you can tell everything changes, their voice changes, their faces change. When they drop an unexpected bomb right in the middle of a conversation, you go with that. You have to go with that because obviously that's an arresting moment.
So besides not stepping on the person who's speaking, you also have to give them a chance to breathe every now and then too. And what I mean by that is every now and then they'll stop. And sometimes it's to gather their thoughts. Sometimes they're waiting for you to ask another question, but many times they're not. So you let the pause exist and you say, okay, just pleasantly smile back and wait for them to continue. And if they don't, then you ask your next question, but don't immediately jump on the fact that there isn't anything being said at the time. Like I said, it's a conversation and not a deposition.
Well, two other things that are consistent with what we're saying, and that is that do not be arrogant and do not be superior to the person you're interviewing. And a lot of times academics can do that. You really are trying to just be a human being. And so if you come across as like more than they do, they may have their own life they're telling you, but you know more about the circumstances. Try and repress that. Because I've seen several interviewers over the year who are very, very arrogant and very, very superior to the subjects they're talking to. And that just totally negates the purpose. The other thing that kind of goes with that, and this has happened on several occasions for different reasons, but mostly if you're doing oral histories of primarily veterans, but there's been a few other times that I've had somebody literally become emotional and cry on camera. You can tell them about, I'll tell them real quick. So oddly enough, some of these gentlemen that we're doing the interviews with or going through the interviews, they're all pretty stoic, and there's moments when you can see they're really fighting to keep it together. But I have had 2 interviews out of many where literally the man, and one of them triggered it absolutely not a moment I would have even thought, but somehow he got to thinking about his comrades that didn't come back. And he literally he starts to cry and then literally puts his head in his hands and just goes like this. And they kept rolling. Now, when it gets to be that, and I'm talking like sobbing, you take a moment. So, and nobody says a thing on the set. Everybody's just waiting for him to get a hold of himself. Well, that's when you stop camera. You stop camera and you sort of say, take your time. We're with you. Can you go on? Somebody get him a glass of water. If you're interested in people's stories, you have to show that you're compassionate to their stories. Even if I've had an elderly man that was was an African-American artist and had some horrific things happen to him in his early childhood, and tears came down. We continued with that one though, because he got himself right back together. You talk about Ray Nance.
Well, Ray Nance was from Bedford, was the only surviving officer from the company in Bedford on D-Day. And he was talking about his experience on D-Day, which he was shot 4 times, and his whole war was on the beaches of Normandy. And when he was talking, he stopped for a second because he was talking about the machine gun bullets coming at him, and he was there. He was back on Normandy. You could see it in his eyes, and you could see his eyes watching the bullets come towards him. And so there are moments like that, and then he kind of brought himself back into the present and continued on. That was kind of significant. It was something that wouldn't have made any sense in an audio interview, but definitely made sense when you saw it. Mine just left. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Was one of the questions that come up about how do you get to do this and do it well. And it's like the old joke about how do you get to Carnegie Hall. The only way to do this is practice. You got to do it, and you got to do it, and you got to do it more. It's not as easy as it sounds to get down and get someone to open up and tell you their life story. We've had a lot of experience doing it, and we usually get people pretty comfortable. And sometimes they get even more comfortable after they're finished. And we've had people, after they've given us their story and recorded it, then they tell us the rest of the story. But even so, it takes a long time to kind of develop a sense. And if you're going to do it yourself, you just got to keep doing it. And if it doesn't work the first time, learn from the first experience and make it better the second time, and make it even better the third time. And that's the way you have to carry on doing these interviews. And the final aspect of conducting the interview is you need to release these people. But what that is you need to have a piece of paper saying that they agree that you can use this interview for whatever your intended plans were. There's some other information that is included as handouts, and one of them is called a deed of gift, which is a fancy way of saying it's a model release. But basically, it's a piece of paper that acknowledges that they've done the interview and that they grant you the rights to either put it into a collection or use it in whatever manner you see fit. But legally, you need to have a release because if you don't, then if you use it against and not have the release, then you are subject to some legal ramifications. And it's a simple thing. The one that we use most of the time is just a paragraph long, basically saying I agree to let Cinnabar use their image and likeness and sound for whatever purpose they deem fit, because we've explained to them in advance what it's going to be used for, or at least what our intentions are. And that's essentially what your release is going to say.
Something else I forgot.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to mention one thing, and that is that if you are doing these oral histories because they're part of whatever your foundation, whatever your a museum, or maybe, you know, it's like a folklore society, anything like that, you're doing that because that's what you concentrate on. And so you may have to do a little background. Rich began in the beginning about you know, getting some knowledge and background in it. Because we live in a state that's just literally full of Navy, Air Force, Marine, Army bases. Rich was in the Air Force for 20 years and also did interviews in the Air Force. So usually if there's a unforeseen circumstances, but they haven't happened. He conducts most of the military interviews because he is a military historian, and that's really fluid for him. It's not to say he can't do any other interview. He has, and I've watched. And so if that's that's something that you ought to look at when who's going to do the interviews. If someone has at least some knowledge or is willing to get some knowledge. My expertise is primarily in indigenous people and African American artists. And so I have been in those communities for over 25 years and working with them in various and sundry ways. And so I'm very comfortable with them. But a good interviewer is able to do the research and still ask the questions. There's one other thing.
Yeah, well, and part of that too is when you're dealing with people of other ethnicities or other groups that you're not part of, that's where being compassionate and empathetic come into play. We did the Tuskegee piece, and it was premiered up in Washington. There was a lot of people there that were wondering what a couple of white videographers and video people were doing, telling an African American story. And they, at the end of it, when they said that they saw that we treated it fairly, and the people that participated in it had all done so willingly, they understood that you don't have to be part of a group to be empathetic with a group or sympathetic with a group and still be able to convey their story accurately. I think that's very important. And one last note about conducting an interview. You don't want to have any extraneous people in the room, because what will happen is the person being interviewed will talk to them or check with them. One of the pitfalls of any oral history is that a person's going to self-censor, particularly if they don't know you, and kind of goes with being not part of a group too. They're not sure how much they can trust you with their information because it is their story. And that's one of the greatest trust that a person has, is sharing their story with you. And so, I don't know, I mean, it's, we said that most of the time that the greatest gift that we get out of this job, which hasn't been financially so far, has been the ability to share other people's stories. So you want to keep people out of the room. The only people that should be there is the person doing the interview, the interviewee, and if there's any crew that's required, if you have a, that kind of a setup. Okay. So now we got the interview, got the release, and it's like, now what? First and foremost, you need to make a recording, a copy of whatever you got, just to preserve it, because stuff happens. And you want to back it up, and that's where you go back and you think about, what are my storage requirements? What do I need to put it in? Then there's the option of transcription. That's that's probably as close to archival as you're going to get, is having a transcript. Transcripts are imperfect at best. We are currently in a project doing roughly 600 transcriptions of histories of veterans from World War II through probably the early 2000s. And you have a whole sort of issues. One of them is that a transcript doesn't have an accent that the people who did the interview do, particularly if they're from the South, where most of ours are from. There are different ways of getting a transcription done. You can sit down and listen and do it. You can pay somebody to do it. That runs roughly about $1.50 a minute or about $90 an hour. You can have it computer transcripted, which runs anywhere from 10 cents to 20 cents per minute. And the computer is only as good as its programming. AI isn't quite there yet. It doesn't pick up pauses, and it doesn't know the spellings of 90% of towns in Korea, Vietnam, or
South Pacific.
South Pacific. So we were working on this particular project. We're doing a hybrid where we have it computer transcribed, and then we go through and polish it up. And it's taken a little bit longer than we had originally anticipated, only because of things like Southern accents that the computer, who we think was programmed in England.
Yeah, because whenever we refer to somebody weighed 200 pounds, it has the English pound sign in front of it instead of pounds after it. So yeah, it's kind of an indicator.
And every now and then we get honor or with
Yeah,
a U. So.
Yeah, so
But transcriptions are an important way of preserving it, and it's a way of having it available to people who have hearing impairments, which when we get back to, since I mentioned that real quickly, if you're interviewing somebody that is a little bit hard of hearing, I have a link that's on the resources page that goes into great detail about conducting interviews for people with hearing impairments. Obviously, you can use whiteboards. You can speak loud and slow. There are a lot of different approaches to do that.
Right,
iPads, and a lot of technology is available. But the transcription is a good way for them to be able to see and share with other people's stories. So you decide to transcribe it or not. The other thing that you need to do is catalog it. There's a lot of good, simple spreadsheets, name, assign it a number, and birth date, a few other things, and keep track of it that way. And last but not least, we'll just quickly touch on a couple of other uses for it. You keep it yourself. You can send it off to some other larger collections. Some of the bigger museums have collections, National Archives, Library of Congress have programs.
you can make it available to the public. You know, a lot of people research certain periods of time, so that's always a great idea. It does no good to have anything done and then sit on the shelf where it's never used again, or you know, wait for that moment when we're going to use it. It's really, a lot of people are interested in their history, but and especially in these times, they're not getting the full history. So maybe that's a way to combat that by telling the sincere and actual history from the first person. So yeah, I think it's a great way for people to learn. And so the African American project we mentioned was very well looked at, because even though it wasn't good quality at all, these were people who grew up in a certain era in a rural southern town, and they were African American and clearly descended from slaves and not very far from that. And so a lot of people were interested in that project. And that's about it.
I think we've kind of used up our time.
Yep.
Can't hear you, Sue.
Sorry, I hadn't unmuted myself. I'll come back on just to say we are about at time, and to thank you both for sharing with us your expertise and also your experiences in a really vivid way. It's really good to hear about the kinds of things you've experienced with people and the people you've interviewed, because it's a very human thing you're doing. And I think our listeners are probably getting a lot of food for thought, and there's lots of material to cover here. And as I said to the folks in chat, we'll be sharing all these handouts with you on the YouTube channel. But I do have some questions, and I'll just read them to the both of you, and you guys can take a stab at these. So our first question is, do you use a transcription service or software in post-production in your oral histories to make them more accessible for both editing and accessibility purposes? You've kind of answered that already, but
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to say anything more about service or software.
We've used a service. We've used a couple of different ones. We've used a transcription service that I'll give them a plug because I've used them, rev.com, who do live transcriptions. In other words, they have a person doing it, and it runs about, like I said, $1.50 a minute. We did this project we're working now with the 600 oral histories that we're transcribing. We used a computer transcription service. The one we happen to be using now is Sonix. It's Sonix, but there are a couple other ones out there that are probably its equal. They're as good as the audio recordings are, is about the best I can put it.
Yeah. And that's, of course, it's according to your budget. So if you have a small group of oral histories, not a lot of time, then a human transcriptionist is probably best. I mean, because you can, but if you've got what we've got right now, 400 oral histories we're doing all this work on, it would have been astronomical to have it done by a human, not to mention it would have been very slow. So.
The thing that even the persons who are doing live transcriptions, I worked with Rev in two different cases. I worked with them in Maryland Public Television when we were doing a documentary about the Vietnam War, and we did 100 interviews, oral histories for that, and they had the money, so they sent it off for a live transcription. But even then, they didn't understand a lot of the military terms, and they didn't recognize acronyms. And they had a problem with a lot of locations in Vietnam trying to figure out where they were. We're doing an awful lot of Google searches for places and names and things to get it as accurate as we can, but we don't claim 100% either, even.
But it's close.
It's close.
Let's just say when the guy said that they were firing mortars, the computer came back, they were firing Mormons. So that was kind of like, oh, I don't think they're doing that. But,
Probably not.
yeah, that was easy because context,
I just put some of your answers in the chat or in the Q&A in the wrong question. So just for viewers, just note that I mentioned rev.com that Rich had suggested they use as a transcription service. Sonix was another one. And I noted that at Virginia Humanities, we've used Otter for transcription. So Andrew has a question. I teach high schoolers. Any tips for a student that wants to try oral history or opportunities?
Okay, so I'll answer this one. My daughter, who was raised in my profession, she when she was in high school, she had to do a meaningful, she was an advanced writer, and so she had to do a meaningful interview and put it into basically a report using the interview. And so her godfather had had a very colorful history, and so she went and interviewed Joe, and I gave her pointers to what questions to ask. And he was very comfortable with her. So he answered, basically he immigrated from Northern Ireland after he got caught running guns, ended up going through Canada down to Massachusetts, where John F. Kennedy got him citizenship. Very, very colored past. And when Lindsay wrote it, she did very well. Like I said, she's a good writer, but she knew because she had seen me interview. So high school kids can really do it. They should find somebody they find interesting and not necessarily famous per se. Could be, a lot of people do other families. That's, that was they did. And then later on, when she was in VCU, she had to do another interview with a nonprofit director. So I knew Norman Burns, who was at that time the head of Maymont. And so she went up and interviewed him as to the significance of why historic properties are important. So yeah, I think any young person can do it. Matter of fact, even better maybe than adults.
Yeah, again, the secret of it is just pick a topic that interests them and then find the people to talk to. And they can do it without, I mean, high schools have the equipment to do it, but I mean, they can still do it even on a cell phone and do it, practice with an audio recording to get started with it.
Great. Randy asks, is there an oral history certification?
Not that I'm aware of. There's several, oral history has an organization that you can check out. I think it's at oralhistory.org. And I think that you do a Google search on oral history, you'll see that just about every university has a link to some sort of oral history program that they're involved with. So, I mean, there's a lot of interest in it all across the country, and there's a lot of sites in England too that
Yeah.
are listed on. I mean, on an easy Google search, just type in oral history, and be amazed at how many responses, or how many links come up.
Okay. Kathleen asks, could you comment on any current or new recommendations for final product archival storage, digital and actual?
We are putting things to DVD right now because it's we have videos. The DVD is actually not a video DVD, but it's a DVD that has a video file, an audio file, and the transcription files on it. So it serves as a single record that somebody could put in and access. We're also backing the whole thing up to a hard drive, an external hard drive. So as I said before, the medium that you actually record on is very volatile. One of the things, even with a computer chip, is that if the chip goes bad, you lose everything on it, which is why it's important that you back up everything that you have.
Right.
And the standard way is to back it up onto some sort of other digital media. Flash drives work too, but it just depends on how much information you have. And again, if the flash drive goes bad, it's all bad usually. So it's like you pay your money, takes your chance.
And things change so fast.
The second part of the question was, what do you do to prevent an overload of data? And she was just referring to the different types of files you might have. You might have media, text, audio, video, image, scans. All of it's important. I guess maybe none of them has more importance than the other, but maybe what you're saying, Rich, is the video is the most challenging to save, or space-wise?
Well, space-wise, it's usually the largest.
Yeah. Okay.
Because even high-res scans of photos aren't
Right.
equivalent to 1 second of video.
Right.
Okay, we have a couple more questions. I think we've got time. Victoria asks, have you ever had a situation where most of your interviews were video, but perhaps some folks didn't want to be seen on video or wanted to remain more anonymous?
No.
No.
I did a full project that was an all audio project with Reynolds Metals, where I interviewed people from the Reynolds family all the way down to the people that were stamping out aluminum foil, and talked to some of the people at the research centers, and that was all done strictly audio, but it was only a question of funding more than their willingness to be on camera. But I did go to their houses, which is also a consideration if you have a video crew, storming into a house and setting up lights and things like that can be kind of intrusive. But if we've been asked to do an oral history on video, we've never had somebody go, never mind. That's usually pre-selected in advance.
One thing that has helped and is that when you're usually doing a set of oral histories, it's some subject in particular, and doesn't have to be limited, but we'll say, and I was just reading about this, so it popped into my mind, the Tulsa Massacre. So you may have survivors that have a survivors group, and so they support one another and they may encourage one another. One of the things with these histories we're doing now was Danville had a memorial to Korean War vets being erected, and they had because they call it the Forgotten War. They had a group of people from the area, Martinsville, all around that area. They had a group get together to get this memorial, and they basically just tapped, went right into them. And so Joe did it. Oh, he said it wasn't bad. Ed did it. A lot of times it's, the group of people. They'll come back and say, that wasn't bad. You should do it.
Okay, we have a good question here from Linda. Any recommendations for starting out on post-recording processing?
Not sure what I mean.
What does that mean?
I mean, maybe it's sort of like once you've collected all of the material, kind of what's step one,
Well,
or how to do the editing of the video itself if you need to do video.
Well, if you're going to, I mean, that follows into, post interview use. The interviews normally you preserve intact and you save them intact because that's how they need to be used. I mean, they don't need an edited version of what a person has to say or executive summary. And just like the transcription is a complete transcription. So from the standpoint of processing, I mean, it's just the file, from in the videos, from color bars to when they cut the camera kind of thing. It's the whole thing. If you're going to use it for something, well, that's a separate entity. We did all these interviews at Tuskegee, and they sat literally for 8 years. 5 years. All right, 5 years. And we ended up finding a sponsor to agree to finishing a video documentary. And then we went back in and we edited them. But we normally don't mess with them. Just like that DVD I was describing on this project that we're doing with the veterans, we're making DVDs that have the video, the audio, and the transcripts for each interview. And then those are going to be preserved by the organization, but they're also donating a copy to the National Archives and the Library of Congress. And when I worked at Maryland Public Television on that project, that's exactly what they did too. They made a DVD copy. They did printed out transcripts as well. I don't think that the organization we're working with right now wants to spend the money or kill that many trees to do that, but
well, the other thing I'll say real quick about editing, because I mean, at one point I was a producer, no, I was a videographer editor, and editing is easier than it used to be. And there's a lot of fairly inexpensive programs out there to edit videos, to edit them down and to even make a program if you want. The thing is that the other thing about editing is it's an art to edit. And I don't mean like just taking out, let's just take out the flubs and stuff like that. That's just taking out the bad parts of it together. But to put into some sort of cohesive story, you kind of have to start as you're planning to shoot, so you know what you want and you know what you get. And that's back to being a program rather than an oral history. And we do both, but it's you can probably get that. You can teach yourself how to edit now because it's that simple, more or less. But you really have to have them. It's like putting a jigsaw puzzle together. You have 5,000 pieces and you've got to put it together so it tells that story. And it's not that easy to do.
And visually, if you're doing an oral history, all you have is a person talking on camera. And when you're editing, you normally would want to, if there's any break or anything you need to cut away or want to show what that person is talking about, it becomes a much more involved process of having other imagery that you can work with.
I think this is great. I'm going to give you the last question and then we'll end our chat today. So Linda wants to know, how do you handle dialect in your transcriptions?
Not well.
If we can hear it, we try to keep the transcription as accurate as possible.
Yeah.
So we don't correct grammar. Like I said, we have a lot of Southern colloquial uses of words. We don't edit them for content. So if they say something That's a function of their time and place, and that's what they said. That's what the transcript says. And as far as dialect, hopefully they can make some sense out of it.
Yeah, dialect is interesting because, I mean, literally, we have been all over the country and we have had some very interesting dialect and also, local isms. There's a word I can't suddenly lost, but the that's the point of listening back to the recording and looking at the transcript. And yes, there was a whole group of people that were pretty much from rural Appalachian, Virginia, who said things like, "Well, we was working on that," and I did not correct their grammar because it's how they talk. So, but there was a couple of times where the computer was like, "I have no idea what that person said," and so but I mean, I've done everything from literally having my ear to the speaker to putting on a headset and earbuds, and eventually you get it, and sometimes you can slow it down depending upon what you're listening on, so you can sort of get it that way. It's not, I would say, it's not it's not an obstruction that cannot be,
No,
gotten
I mean,
around.
some of it you have to know too, like what you're dealing with. So if you know you're dealing with somebody from upstate New York and they're talking about going to Child Eye, you know that it's going to be spelled out. It looks like chili when you do the transcription. It's just having some understanding of what you're who and what you're dealing with.
But you can usually, if if listening to them is pretty easy if you're proofing the transcription. So
I have one final question. So are you guys game to take a final question,
Oh,
even though I
sure.
said the last one was the final? Because this one might be something you've got some experience with. Any suggestion for an app or software to present oral interviews on smart screens or kiosks?
An app. Well, first off, you need to probably cut it down, which means you're going to be editing it in some fashion because, like I said, most of these oral histories run about an hour, and having an uninterrupted hour probably won't make much sense in the long run. And you want to cut it down to maybe some key stories. So there's some editing involved there. And then there are different there's equipment out there like BrightSign that lets you it's a piece of hardware that lets you put a file into that you can program, and you can program it to be in a touchscreen way to play different segments or play different people. When we did this one piece for the Historical Society, of the interviews that they did, it was to be put into a kiosk, because what they had done in the past was they had all these DVDs in folders, and if you wanted to hear the story, you had to go pull the folder out, pull the DVD out, put it into a DVD player. So what we did for them is we created in the kiosk environment where you could just push on the face of the person, and then their interview would come up. And that was all done some pretty simple. I mean, it was done
Yeah, pretty
internally
software.
on the
Yeah.
in the device itself. So there isn't any one in particular that I'm sorry that I have off the top of my head that I would recommend.
No.
Though it's simple to do.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think that's probably what this person is thinking of, is just what you were describing, that interactive piece where you could access that interview by
Right.
touching the person's face or name.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I said, BrightSign is a piece of equipment that does that fairly inexpensively, and it's a drag and drop software. As far as if you have the file, you just drag it, and it's very easy to set up.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for taking the time today to give us your overview of how to do an oral history and all of your experiences from the field. This has really been great. We will share the video on our YouTube channel as promised, along with all of the attachments that you both provided us. Rich, Sherry, we really appreciate it.
Thank you for
you.
asking us.
Yes, enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I know.
Bye-bye.